Thorn pulled the hood of her cloak tight around her head, her round ears conspicuous in this cruel city of elves. It was midday, and the market was packed. The knife-eared elves sold their goods from beneath colourful tents. The sense of cooking meat and burning incense filled the air. Thorn knew there would be no mercy if she was caught, but sometimes the easiest place to disappear was in a crowd. The path through the market was narrow, and she could smell the oiled hair of the elves as she walked. She stole a glance from under her hood as she passed a blacksmith's shop. She shuddered when she saw the harvested that stood behind the anvil. His eyes had been torn out, replaced by red jewels that glittered in the fire of the forge. His arms had been distorted into tools, his left hand a pair of grips that held iron on the anvil, and his right a hammer that smashed steadily against the hot metal. He wore a fine red silk shirt. The elves loved to show their wealth, their excess, through their human slaves. Thorn felt her face flush as she thought of that poor soul, who he was before the elves turned him into a mindless monstrosity. He was not alone. Each stall had at least one malformed human in it, their bodies shaped into perversions that the elves thought beautiful. She kept moving. She needed to find something valuable, or at least shiny enough to trade well outside the city's walls. She found her mark. A tall male elf was standing in front of a spice vendor. He inhaled from a long hose he held in his hand. Its ornate golden mouthpiece clicked against his pointed teeth. A harvested stood next to him. She wore a sheer white dress that draped elegantly over her slender frame. Thorn realized with horror that the hose was attached to the woman. Her torso had been hollowed out, and a water pipe sat in her abdomen, the gurgling bubbles visible through the sheer cloth of her dress. The elf exhaled red smoke as he lifted his palm to his pearl-white nose, smelling the black spice he had scooped from an ornate barrel. Thorn looked at the elf's belt. Dozens of trinklets dangled from the leather strap. Each was made of gold and inlaid with gems. She had no idea what they were, and she did not care. She knew the waresman in the forest would trade for them handsomely. She reached inside her cloak and wrapped her fingers around the hilt of her dagger. For a moment, she thought of slitting the elf's throat. She smiled as she imagined him falling to the ground, his pale hands trying to stop his green blood as it spurted from his neck. She let the thought pass. She walked behind the elf and cut one of the trinkets from his belt. No fuss, no drama. The pompous ass wouldn't have noticed if she had ripped the belt from his waist. She stepped away from the spice vendor stall and back into the flowing bodies on the path. She moved with them, blending in as she made her way back to her exit. She turned down an alley. The massive windowless buildings on either side cast a tight space in dark shadows. She knelt and waited. No one followed, no one saw. She slid through the drain that was cut in the ground and dropped into the sewer. The sound of her feet splashing in the moisture, the only noise that broke the silence of the dark catacombs. She pulled a torch and flint from inside her cloak. She leaned the torch against the wall and struck the flint with her dagger. Flashing sparks lit the dark each time her dagger struck, until an ember caught the torch and it blazed to life. She moved swiftly through the sewers. She had been there many times. Her prize was heavy in her pocket as she made her way to her exit. The waresman held the elven trinket in front of his face, turning it in his hand as he inspected it.
"And where did you get this?"
he said, the words lisping as his tongue hit the space where his 2 front teeth used to be.
"What can you give me for it, Caspar?"
The waresman reached into the back of the wagon they stood next to and pulled out 2 brown canvas bags. He dropped them in front of Thorn. She looked down at them and then knelt and opened them, looking at the goods inside.
Look, Thorn, you gotta stop going in there.
Thorn took a green apple from the sack and held it between her teeth while she continued to rummage through the bag.
And then how the hell am I gonna pay you, huh?
She said, as she bit into the apple, speaking around the chunk of fruit in her mouth.
All I'm saying is you need to watch yourself. The knife ears are pushing their patrols hard. I saw harvesters out as far as the downstone the other day.
He looked down at her as she opened the second bag. Her hands stopped and she was still for a moment. She swallowed the apple in her mouth and looked up at the waresman.
You know what those monsters do to us?
She stood, her face red as she looked Caspar in his eyes.
You've seen it yourself. Well, I mean, you've seen glimpses at least. Well, I've seen it up close. I've been this close.
She moved to within inches of his face. He took a step back and bumped against the wagon.
You just don't get yourself killed, all right?
He turned and climbed into his wagon, taking the reins of the huge ox into his hands. Thorn had returned to inspecting the bags, and he looked at her. His heart was heavy as he watched her dig through his wares. He raised the reins, ready to drive the ox onward. He lowered them. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply.
Hey, Thorn.
She looked up at him as he rummaged in the things behind him. He pulled a folded piece of paper from the pile.
Take this, at least.
He held the paper out, and Thorn walked over and took it from his hand. She unfolded it, and her heart quickened when she recognized what it was. A map of the city.
Where did you get this? A waresman never tells.
Thorn finished.
Yeah, I know.
She waved her hand in front of their faces.
Take care of yourself, Thorn.
He raised the reins again, and this time snapped them down. The ox started walking, and Caspar left Thorn alone as she stared at the map. Thorn looked at the ruins written on the map. She could read the writing of the elves. Everyone could. The human tongue had all but vanished over the last 100 years. The paper was rough in her hands, a thick, brown parchment with water stains marked across its surface. The city was drawn elegantly. The smooth lines of an elven quill were obvious. Thorn felt her mouth dry. She had been going into the city for months now. Of course she told herself it was to get supplies, but every time she went into that decadent tell, she felt something stir inside her. She could feel it growing behind her heart. She tried to convince herself it was nothing, that it was foolish and wrong. But every time she saw the pitiful, twisted form of a harvested, she knew something had to be done. Before going into the city, she had only heard stories of the harvested. Her uncle would sit by the fire and spin horrific tales of twisted flesh and screaming mouths. They would laugh together to break her fear, but he had never seen them either. He was taken by the elves 5 years ago. First harvested she had seen stood by the gates of the city. His arms were warped. They were gilded and fused to the winch that raised the ramparts. He stood silent and still, his gemstone eyes looking across the moat and into the trees, seeing nothing. Thorn shook her head, snapping herself away from her memories. With the map in her hand, she could do something. She didn't know what that was yet, but she could feel the passion behind her heart growing again as she looked across the black lines of the city map. Her eyes stopped on an amphitheatre. Her forays into the city had brought her close to it before, but she hadn't known that. The ruins that sat in the centre of the theatre read, "Ritual of Perfection." That was it. That had to be it. That was where the knife-eared bastards made the harvested. She knew they thought they were creating something beautiful, something perfect, out of their human clay. She rubbed her chin with her hand as she felt the heat return to her face. The warmth of adrenaline flowed through her body in a swift wave. She couldn't wait to get back to the city now. She pulled a strong, dry limb from the forest floor. She drew her dagger and dragged the blade along the old wood, clearing it of its crooked branches. She put one bag on each side of the stick and slung it across her shoulders. She started to walk towards home. The forest was calm. The sun was falling toward the horizon, and the night animals began to stir, while the day animals finished their activities. The crickets chirped, while the squirrels gathered acorns in the shade of ancient oak trees. Thorn followed a game trail. It was as much her trail as any of the other animals that called these woods home. She was swift, and her steps were practiced. She listened to the sound of the river as it flowed by the trail. Its water wound slowly as it moved toward the lake at the downstone. The forest was alive with noise. The hoots of owls joined the woodland song as the sun fell farther. Thorn paused. Something was not right. She was frozen. The forest had gone quiet. Only the sound of the river cut through the silence. No, there was something else. She shifted her head, listening deeply into the forest. She dropped the bags, and her heart pounded as she knelt. Elves. She could hear the patrol walking through the woods. They were quiet, but this was her home. She crawled to the gnarled trunk of a nearby tree and peered from behind it. She stayed low as she scanned the sparse grove. There they were, a party of 7 elves, their pearl-coloured heads and hands, the only skin showing outside their form-fitting leather clothing. 2 of the elves walked in front of the group. One held a braided rope in his hand, a deep scar cut across his face. She could hear them speaking as they moved towards her.
"A fine beast you have there, Sarath,"
one said to the other.
Thank you, Cyril. My children have been smitten by the thing. Thought it time to take it on the hunt before it gets used to their pampering.
"Ha, a wise choice. The artist sculpted one of the humans' infants into a beautiful pet for my own children, and they haven't left it alone since I brought it home."
The sound of their voices made Thorn's blood boil.
Wait,
The elf holding the rope said as he raised his hand.
it's found something.
Thorn saw the beast rise from the grass. It stood on its hind legs. It was hunched over. Its hands dangled at its chest like a rabbit listening for predators. Its face, once human, had been stretched into a long canine snout. Slits cut from its nostrils to its pointed ears were rubbed with a bright blue dye. A golden ring hung from its distorted nose. The first 2 knuckles on each of its fingers had been skinned, and the bones were sharpened and capped with gold. It sniffed at the air. Its gemstone eyes saw nothing, but its head shifted wildly as it picked up Thorn's scent. She pulled her head back behind the tree's trunk and felt a pressure build in her forehead as her mind raced. She thought fast and dropped to her chest. She crawled toward the river as she heard the elf release the beast from its rope. It moved toward her as she crawled steadily. She could hear its grotesque nostrils sniffing the air as her hands splashed into the water. She dragged herself into the river as she heard the beast break through the foliage behind her. She took a deep breath and reached under the surface, grabbing hold of a sunken tree. She pulled herself under and held her breath as she stared up at the water's surface. The fading evening light flickered on the rippling surface as she strained her eyes against the blur of water. She could see the form of the beast moving to the water's edge. It was a shimmering blur beyond the surface of the clear, flowing water. It came closer, and she could see its long snout. The blue ink that highlighted the slits along its face stood out against its pale skin. It leaned over her. It did not enter the water, but she could see its head shifting again and knew it was searching the air for her scent. Her lungs were burning as she held her breath. Her hands grasped the tree tightly, and her heart pounded in her ears, the thumping of the straining muscle amplified by the water. The beast turned its head. its blind eyes looking directly at her. Her diaphragm convulsed, the contractions painful as her body tried to force her to take a breath. Thorn heard a high-pitched whistle. It was loud even to her submerged ears. The beast snapped its head up, looking to the sound before it bolted away from the river and back into the forest. Thorn still held her breath. She tried to give the patrol time to move off. The pain was unbearable, and she finally burst from the water, inhaling violently as her head broke the surface. She sucked the air into her lungs and forced it out again, the violent breaths contorting her body as she forced oxygen back into her blood. She crawled onto the riverbank and pulled her heavy, wet cloak from her shoulders. She wrung it out as much as she could and carried it under her arm to where she had left her bags. Twilight hung through the forest, and she knew she needed to be well on her way home before the full darkness of night came. She wrapped her cloak around the tree limb that held her bags, hoisted it back over her shoulders, and again walked along the trail towards home. She turned off the well-worn path and walked through the bush for a while longer. The night was thick when she reached her home. She walked up a small, tree-covered hill and crouched down looking for something. She looked over her shoulders and listened to the night air before she lifted a patch of ground from the hill. A hidden, grass-covered hatch led into her home. She looked around once more before throwing her bags down into the opening and descended on a well-crafted, well-worn wooden ladder. She closed the hatch behind her. There was no light, and she could see nothing, but she didn't need her eyes. She moved through the dark and struck her flint. The sparks lit the room, and one fell on the kindling that sat in the fireplace she was standing in front of. The fire slowly grew until it was burning steadily. The smoke funneled up the chimney and out of one of the hollowed-out trees that stood on the hill. She had packed the tree with moss to dampen the smoke, but still knew there was a risk. There was a risk with everything. Her home was comfortable, and the fire cast a warm glow across the small space. Pots, pans, and other supplies hung by the hearth, and bedding laid neatly nearby. A small table sat against the wall opposite the fire, and Thorn sat on an old wooden stool she pulled from under it. She spread the map on the table in front of her and squinted at its fine markings. Her eyes strained in the dim light. She stood, taking a lamp from the table and lighting it in the fire before returning to her seat. She studied the market as it was drawn on the map. She found her bearings and placed her finger where her entrance was. It was unmarked on the map. She took this as a good omen. She looked at the amphitheatre and traced her finger from her clandestine entrance point, along the market paths, down side streets, and finally to the entrance of the theatre. She could get there. She knew it. The sound of her father's voice came to her mind.
"Think twice, and then think again,"
he had always said to her as he guided her in the forest. He was taken 4 years ago. She did think twice. She thought all night. She thought of the poor women whose body had been violated to make room for Elven vice. Thought of the man who blindly formed iron for his decadent, soft-handed owner. She wrapped herself in her bedding and stared at the shadows that danced along the walls as the fire burned. In those shadows, she could see the cruel elves that stalked the forest as they released that poor beast to mark her trail. She could see its face, blurry and distorted, behind clear water as she fell into the lap of dreams. The fire was dead when she woke, but the room was still warm. The embers glowed and her lamp was still burning. Her well-adjusted eyes could see enough in the gloom. She gathered her clothing from the rack and checked that all was dry before getting dressed. She wrapped her belt around her waist and was comforted by the weight of the grim dagger at her hip. She would go to the city today. She needed to see that amphitheatre with her own eyes. She needed to see where the grim rituals took place. She didn't know what she would do then, but she would get there and find out. She took an iron pot from the wall and placed it on the smouldering embers. She filled the pot with water that she poured from a clay container. She took 2 potatoes from one of the sacks she had gotten from the waresmen and dropped them into the warming water. She lowered herself to the floor and blew gently into the embers. They grew bright and warmed her face. She pulled the stool from the table and sat in front of the fire, staring at the pot until it began to boil. She thought of her mother and how she would smile as she cooked, preparing whatever meager food they had scavenged or traded for. She was taken 3 years ago. She scooped the potatoes from the pot with an iron spoon and dropped them into a wooden bowl she held in her lap. She blew on them until they were cool to her touch. The starchy flesh stuck to the roof of her mouth as she ate them in large and tasting bites. She stared into the dying embers with cold eyes as she chewed each flavourless mouthful. She finished her meal and put the dirty bowl on the floor next to the pot. She looked at the map on the table once more. Again, she traced the path from her entrance to the amphitheatre. She folded the parchment and put it into a pocket in her cloak. She took 3 torches from the wall and placed them in the other side of her cloak, checked her flint, and stood at the ladder. She climbed and placed her hand on the hatch. She cracked the hatch open. The sun was painful on her eyes as they adjusted to the bright sun. She looked around and saw nothing. She opened the hatch and climbed into the day. She closed the hatch and ran her hands along its seams, pushing the dirt and grass together to disguise the faint cracks. It was a fine day. She thought of the time spent chasing her younger brother through the patches of bright blue flowers that covered the hill, while her parents tried not to make it obvious that they were watching the woods for danger. He was taken 3 years ago. Now, she felt nothing as she trampled blue flowers beneath her feet. She walked to the trail and followed it towards the city. She was alert but unthinking. She was numb as she put one foot in front of the other. Her instincts guided her and protected her. They allowed her to fall into herself and escape the world as she walked. In time, she came to the forest's edge. She crouched low. She looked out across the plain in front of her. She looked to the sewer's entrance. It was far from the city and close to her. The sentries could not see this far, but she knew to be wary. Think twice and think again, she thought to herself. She pulled her hood over her head and moved silently to the sewer. She did not hesitate as she slid herself into the small opening and dropped into the darkness. She could hear rats shuffle away as her feet landed on the cold, wet stone. She lit a torch and began to walk. She knew the way well. The firelight flickered off the grey stone walls as she moved. She could hear the sound of the market as she came to her entry point. She pulled herself up and looked through the slit. The shadow-cast alley was clear, and she pulled herself through the drain. She stood and brushed herself off. She made sure her hood covered her ears and then walked confidently out of the alley and into the flow of elves making their way through the market. The bright colours and exotic smells were overwhelming, but only for a moment. She composed herself as she walked. She pictured the map in her head as she passed elves holding sticks of skewered meat out to passers-by. She walked steadily, undistracted by the buzz of the market. Her heart sank and her blood went cold as she passed the stall of a furniture vendor. She saw the twisted forms of humans that had been shaped into chairs, their limbs stretched and bent into grotesqueries, their engraved skin stretched like fine leather over their distorted bones. She felt bile rise in her throat, but she choked it back down and forced herself to move on. She noticed that the crowd was parting and realized they were making way for something. She joined the elves at the side of the path. She saw what was coming, and her mind stung as she tried to make sense of what approached. Black caravan was being pulled by 4 creatures. They were as tall as horses, but their torsos were thin, their limbs disproportionately long and stiff as they walked. The caravan approached where she was standing, and the crowd began to kneel. She knelt with them and looked out from her hood as the creatures passed. Her mind bent further as she saw what they were. They were harvested, human beings stretched into terrible beasts of burden. Their bodies were naked, except for the eyeless black hoods that covered their heads, and the leather harness that was attached to the reins. Their arms and legs had been stretched to 3 times what they were before. The bones of these elongated limbs were fused, forcing the poor souls to move like stilt walkers. Their naked, frail bodies were covered in brightly colored tattoos, shaped into confusing patterns. They shambled past the kneeling crowd, pulling the obsidian caravan behind them. Thorn could hear the elves talking as she stood.
Weren't they beautiful, Kaltar?
An elven mother said to her son.
Who was that mother?
He asked her.
The artists,
she replied. The voices faded into the crowd, and Thorn watched as the caravan moved along. A wave of elves kneeling and standing followed it as it travelled. A beautiful sound came over the market then, like a chord played on a colossal stringed instrument. Thorn dared to chance a look around her and realised it was coming from the clock tower, a massive building of black stone that towered above the city. The clock itself had a red face with 3 black hands that stood starkly against the crimson backing. The cord rang out again, and a door opened in the clock's face. White sand, an unfathomable amount, began to pour from the opening. It flowed down the back of stones, and Thorn realised the elves around her were all bowing their heads. All chatter had stopped. All the stalls were still. It was as if the entire city had frozen to wait for the sand to fall. The elven child that had spoken before tugged at his mother's waist.
Mother, hush, child,
she said to him in a calm voice.
The work has begun.
The child did not speak after this. He joined the rest in bowing his head. Thorn knew this could only be one type of work. She kept herself from spitting as she shamefully bowed her head. The act of respect towards such terrors filled her with rage, but she calmed herself. It would be no use if she ended up as the victim of that terrible work herself. The sand seemed to pour forever, but it finally stopped and the murmur of the market returned. Thorn was relieved to raise her head and start her march again. She moved quickly to the end of the market, and the street in front of her was suddenly empty as she stepped onto its white cobblestones. She could hear the caravan in the distance as it rattled along the rough stones. She was once again amazed at how easily she slipped through the city. The elves who seemed as sharp as shattered glass could also be as dull as hammers. The sound of the caravan faded, but she knew she was gaining on it. She turned a corner and saw why the sound had quieted. She stood at the edge of the forest of birch trees. They were packed densely, their red leaves forming a thick canopy. She did not stop. She went off the path as she entered the forest park. She was comfortable among the trees. She could hear the sound of the caravan again and followed it. She was silent among the dense woods. She stopped and knelt. She saw the caravan ahead. It waited by a gate. One guard admired the beasts that pulled it while another guard opened the theatre's ornate doors. They swung outward and the caravan entered the amphitheatre. Thorn did not hesitate. She climbed the tree that she knelt beside and perched on the tallest branch she could reach. The walls of the amphitheatre were high, but she could see inside. The theatre was far smaller than she imagined. An intimate setting with room for, she guessed, 100 spectators. It was packed. The crowd wore their finest clothing as they sat quietly, waiting for whatever it was they were about to see. caravan pulled into the theatre, and 2 elves stepped out. They opened a door in the back of the caravan and pulled 2 chained humans out. Their heads were covered by green, opaque orbs, spherical, opalescent clouds that shifted confusingly as the 2 naked, shivering humans were brought to the centre of the theatre. They trembled as they were guided next to 2 stone altars. 2 elves came forward and each reached a hand into the orbs that covered the heads of the humans. The lips of the elves moved, but Thorn could not hear what they said. The humans stopped shuddering. They climbed onto the stone slabs and lay down, each completely still. 2 more elves walked to the side of the pair that had subdued the prisoners. They each pushed a black stone slab that hovered above the dark ground by means of some unknown magic. The crowd stirred. They leaned forward, their rapt attention fully on the ritual in front of them. Thorn watched as some of the elves brought opera glasses to their painted eyes. The 2 elves standing over the humans each took a tool from the myriad of fine instruments that lay neatly on the stone slabs next to them. Thorn could not see exactly what the tools were, but their black surfaces glinted in the light as the elves lowered them to the prisoners' chests simultaneously. Thorn raised her hand to her mouth and stifled a gasp as the elves dragged the tools down the torsos of the unmoving humans. Their chests burst open, as if springs had held them closed. Their ribs shone with blood as they opened, exposing the beating hearts and twisted organs beneath them. Thorn gripped the tree's limb tighter as she felt her vision blurring. She steadied herself, and the tunnel of her vision widened.
Beautiful, isn't it?
Thorn's stomach dropped, and adrenaline ripped through her body when she heard the elven voice. She turned and went to draw her dagger as she saw him crouched on a limb behind her. His pointed teeth flashed from inside a wry smile. How? Had he been there this whole time? These were her last thoughts before he smashed her skull with a polished black club. She blinked as she woke. Her vision came into focus and she looked at a stone ceiling. She rolled to her side and saw iron bars. She went to stand but tripped, and when she put her hands out to break her fall, she saw they were bound by golden chains. She looked down and saw that the same gilded metal secured her legs. She pushed herself to her backside and sat staring at the iron bars of her cell.
Little human,
an elven voice came from the shadows beyond the bars.
You didn't think we would let you run amok forever, did you?
The elf walked from the shadows. Thorn pushed herself backwards, scrambling to move as her back hit the cell's far wall. She stared at the elf as he stepped from the shadows. Mouth fell open as she saw the scar that ripped across his face. It was the elf that led the beast in the forest.
How? Shh.
The elf held a finger to his lips.
Hush, girl. We only needed you to grow in that abysmal little hole of yours. You weren't ready. Not yet. Now you are a canvas that the artist can work on.
Thorn's mind reeled as she realized the truth. The coincidences flashed in her mind. All of the 2 easy walks through the city, the seemingly idiot elves that let her wander past and cut the purses off their hips, and the moss. She convinced herself it was enough to mask the smoke of her fires, but now, sitting in the cell in front of this elf, she realized how absurd it all was.
A pity we had to take your brother so young. He would have grown as fine as you.
Thorn felt nothing but rage. She stood and stumbled as she rushed to the iron grate that separated her from the disgusting, baneful elf in front of her. She wrapped her hands around the bars.
You pathetic knife-edged bastard! I swear, I'll fucking kill you! Yes, yes.
He pulled the cork from a vial he took from his pocket.
You all swear one thing or another.
He dropped the vial and walked to the door. It began to smoke. the billowing green cloud spreading through Thorn's cell. The elf put his hand on the door's handle and paused.
You are going to be beautiful.
He opened the door and stepped out. He closed the door behind him, and Thorn heard the heavy bolt close as the green cloud thickened. Her rage only sped the sedative as her screaming lungs sucked in the green smoke. She felt her grip loosen on the bars as the darkness closed on the edges of her vision. Her screams faded to silence, and she was unconscious before she hit the cold stone floor. She woke up and she could not move. She could feel the warmth of air on her naked body, but no matter how hard she concentrated, nothing below her neck would stir. She looked around and realized she could not move her head. It swiveled as she saw where she was. Through the green haze that surrounded her head, she realized she was in the amphitheater. Rows of elves sat patiently in their seats as they waited for the dreadful work to begin. Her breath came in fast, panicked gasps as she realized the reality of her situation. She screamed. The sound was deafening inside the hazy green bubble. The elves she could see standing near did not stir. They could hear nothing. She knew that. She could not hear anything when she had watched this grim scene from afar. She gritted her teeth, staring at the elves through the haze. Her fear was mixed with anger like she had never felt before. She spit at one of the elves, but the saliva disappeared to nothing as it hit the opalescent barrier. They couldn't see her face. She could scream, she could cry, she could rage and weep. They would see nothing. She was nothing to them. She was simply a canvas now. She watched as the elf who stood next to her lowered his hand, and she began to scream again as she saw the tool in his hand. He brought it to her chest, and she could feel the cool, sharp blade on her bare skin. The elf pressed down, and Thorn's screams grew louder, the sound straining her eardrums as her vocal cords began to tear. She desperately tried to move her arm, to grab the vicious tool from the terrible elf's hand and shove it through his eye. It was no use. No amount of will would get her limbs to move. The pain was unfathomable, beyond anything she could imagine, beyond what she thought should have been reality. The cruel blade seemed to cut beyond her flesh as the elf ripped it through her torso. Thorn flailed her head violently. Her vocal cords had worn enough that her raspy screams did not mask the sound of bones in her neck creaking. She raised her head from the stone slab, just as her ribcage burst open. She stared between her open ribs with wide eyes. She looked down at her own beating heart. She clenched her jaw and heard her teeth crack against each other until they began to shatter one by one, filling her mouth with enamel and blood. There was nothing but pain then. She could not think. She heard the bones in her neck creak once more, and a small thought fought its way through the unending agony. She would not let them have her. She would not let them twist her into one of their icons of sadistic decadence. She twisted her head to her shoulder. She screamed and barely made a sound as her flayed open cords struggled to vibrate. She looked further over her shoulder and heard the bones creaking louder. Teeth and blood shot from her mouth, and she sobbed. She rotated her head once more, this time pushing with everything she could muster, the longing to escape the pain driving her beyond any limit. She heard the bones in her neck begin to crack, and that brought her hope. She pushed further. She heard the cracks again, and then she felt the bones give way with a disgusting snap. Her scream stopped short as her mind blinked out of existence. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy these stories, be sure to click subscribe and check out some more stories here.